Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is The Amazing Spider-Man 9, cover dated December of 1963. This issue marks the first appearance of longtime Spider-Man villain Electro, and was written by Stan Lee, drawn by Steve Ditko, and lettered by Art Simic. Our issue opens up with a striking splash page, teasing Spider-Man's coming confrontation with not just Electro, but seemingly all of his supporting cast. Thus, to understand how he's found himself in such a precarious situation, we must first travel to the streets of New York City, as the hero's rushing home in a seeming emergency. It's unclear why he's in such a hurry, but it's evidently so important that he completely ignores an active shootout, and simply swings right past it. Then when he finally makes it back to his neighborhood, he decides to change into his civilian clothes out in the open for all to see. Admittedly, it's rather dark out, but unless he's rushing into a matter of life or death, he'd never risk exposing his identity. But apparently it is a matter of life or death, although he's not the one at risk. It's his elderly Aunt May, who's come down with a bad illness. Thus his great hurry was to get her medication, a task that he could do a lot quicker as Spider-Man than Peter Parker. In any case, she graciously thanks her nephew for the delivery, and then dozes off to get some rest. Evidently her illness is severe, and even worse than she suspects. Thus Peter decides to stay by her side for the many hours to come, just in case she might need anything. So while he's doing that, let's shift focus to the other side of town, where an oddly dressed figure is preparing to reveal himself to the world, in what will prove to be an electrifying display of power. He calls himself Electro, and as one could guess, has the uncanny ability to control electricity. But his power isn't limitless, and he's thus installed a pair of large Tesla coils in his secret hideout. Then by simply standing in between them and turning them on, his body can absorb a tremendous amount of electricity. And now that he's fully powered up, he heads outside, and decides to test his abilities against an armored car that's just stopped to unload. So he approaches its guards as they're carrying out bags of gold, and brazenly demands that they hand them over. But they don't know anything about him, so they just assume that he's some nutty crackpot. But one pulls out a pistol just in case, and Electro quickly disarms him with a bolt of lightning. Thus the guards quickly realize that Electro's more than they can handle, and they swiftly surrender the gold to him. But before we can see any more of the villain or his heist, the issue suddenly shifts focus back to Peter and Aunt May, who've just been visited by a physician. It turns out that May's condition is worse than either had thought, and she needs to be transferred to a hospital immediately. At first she resists the idea, as who will care for Peter in her absence. But he assures her that he'll be just fine on his own, and what's most important is that she gets better. So she's taken to the hospital, and the issue then shifts forward a few hours later as Peter's in school. As usual, he's being heckled by Flash Thompson and co., but with his mind so fraught with worry, he doesn't pay them any attention. And he continues to ignore them until the final bell rings, at which point he rushes out to the hospital that Aunt May's staying at. Evidently she's about to be operated on, but the doctors give Peter some time to see her before she goes under the knife. Yet to his surprise, she's already being seen by a visitor. It's Betty Brant, secretary to J. Jonah Jameson, the publisher of the Daily Bugle newspaper. Seeing as how often Peter sells Jameson photos of Spider-Man, he and Betty have grown rather close. So the two spend some pleasant time with May, and once visiting hours are over, head outside and go their separate ways. While Betty's presumably going back to her home or work, Peter's staying right on the streets. Yet he's not going to be meandering around the city's labyrinth of sidewalks, he's instead going to be swinging above them as Spider-Man. As it turns out, Aunt May's operation is incredibly expensive, and neither she or Peter have the means to pay for it. So he's resorted to the only method that he knows of to get money quick: photography. Thus it's simple, he's going to swing around the city until he spots a crime that he can photograph, and then he'll sell that photo to Jameson. Except that he's not in luck, for as soon as he begins searching, a powerful storm descends on the city. Unfortunately his camera can't take clear photos in the rain, so he's left with nothing to do but pack up his things and head home. And with that, the issue shifts forward a day later into a prominent New York City bank. One of its many clients is none other than J. Jonah Jameson, who's currently bossing around a weary accountant. But while he's keeping the front desk busy with his loudmouth, something strange is going on at the rear entrance. It's Electro, and he's just broken his way into the bank. Luckily there's a guard in the back who notices him, and then rushes to pull the burglar alarm. Yet as soon as he touches its lever, Electro fires off a bolt of electricity that both disables the alarm and knocks him unconscious. Thus the villain simply waltzes into the main room and warns Jameson and the accountant to stay out of his way. But the headstrong publisher just can't help himself and tells Electro that he can't rob the bank. I'm not sure what Jameson expected to come of the comment, but Electro responds by shocking both him and the accountant with some jolts of electricity. While it doesn't injure them, it does cause them a great deal of pain, and so they both decide to just shut up and let Electro do his thing. Thus the villain opens up the electronic vault door, and within a few minutes, leaves the bank with a bag full of money. Once outside, he electrifies, and thus magnetizes his hands and feet, and, like Spider-Man, climbs up a nearby building to escape the scene. A few minutes later, police arrive at the bank and begin questioning witnesses, who all describe Electro as a confident, average-sized man who could climb up walls. Thinking about this description, Jameson comes to the wild conclusion that Electro must be Spider-Man. While it's certainly a far-out theory, he decides that it's unequivocally true once he notices that at that very moment, Spider-Man is swinging away from the scene of the heist. In truth, the hero had simply come to check it out, but realizing that the villain's gone and that the police had it covered, had decided to leave. Of course Jameson disregards this possibility, and instead decides that he's actually Electro, and had hidden the stolen money and changed costumes. So he goes to the police with his apparent findings, but when they press him for evidence, he angrily storms off and decides to take matters into his own hands. Thus the next day's paper is emblazoned with the headline, "Electro is really Spider-Man." But the public's reaction is mixed, as some come to the hero's defense, and others buy into Jameson's lie. Peter unfortunately learns of the accusation while seeing his aunt at the hospital, and just as a physician reminds him that her operation will cost $1,000. Seeing as how he still doesn't have the money, Peter then heads to J. Jonah Jameson's office and in desperation, asks his boss to loan him $1,000. But the frugal publisher refuses to lend anyone money, and tells Peter that he'll only give it to him if he can provide photographic proof that Spider-Man and Electro are the same person. While Peter doesn't take him up on the offer, he does realize that there's a substantial reward for Electro's capture, and he can simply collect that money instead. So he quickly rushes out of Jameson's office, changes into Spider-Man, and then begins prowling the streets for any sign of Electro. But New York's a big place, and he can't be everywhere at once. So he spends the next several hours fruitlessly searching, until his spider sense finally picks up a nearby disturbance. It's actually Electro, and he's trying to break into a rooftop safe. But instead of stopping him, Spider-Man decides that he'll simply let him go, and then follow him to his hideout. Once there, he'll defeat the villain, recover all of the money that he's already stolen, and then collect his reward for capturing him. Thus he simply waits for Electro to finish, and while he's at it, decides to capture a few photos of him. But what he doesn't notice is that there's a mirror inside of the safe that Electro's robbing. Thus the villain spots Spider-Man in its reflection, and immediately turns around to blast him. While the wall crawler's able to dodge the attack and then stick a web onto Electro's face, he makes the mistake of trying to grapple with the villain. As it turns out, Electro's entire body is electrified, and merely touching him could prove lethal. But Spider-Man doesn't know this, and so he receives an electric shock that's akin to being struck by lightning. Thus he's knocked out, and Electro then walks away from their battle unharmed, and with even more stolen cash. Spider-Man wakes up a short while later, and still desperate for money, decides to take up Jameson's earlier offer. But he's obviously not Electro, so how could he possibly prove that he is? Well, he comes up with a clever plan, as he decides to take some photos of himself on the rooftop, and then superimpose them over the shots he got of Electro. Thus it'll seem that the villain had been changing into Spider-Man. So he takes these edited photos to Jameson the next day, and the elated publisher accepts them without asking any questions. And although he can now pay for his aunt's operation, Peter's ashamed of himself for taking the money under false pretenses. But it's too late now, as within hours, Jameson plasters the image all over the day's paper. Yet much of the public remains unconvinced, as even with apparent photo evidence, the publisher's theory doesn't make a lot of sense. Knowing this better than anyone is Electro himself, as he's back in his hideout with a copy of Jameson's paper. Yet even though he's obviously not Spider-Man, he must have at one point been someone. It's not like he was born Electro, unless he's a mutant of course. Well, as it turns out he's not, and he was indeed once a normal person. In fact, his name was Max Dillon, and until recently, he was one of New York City's best electrical linemen. Thus, when one of his co-workers became dangerously stuck on a pole, his supervisor turned to him for help. But Dillon was, as he is now, a callous and greedy person, and only agreed to help after being promised $100. Thus, with his money secured, he went up, and as expected, brought down his co-worker with ease. Yet as he was alone on the pole and preparing to come back down, he was struck by lightning in a 1-in-a-million event. But what's even more miraculous is the fact that he not only survived the accident, but that it somehow gave him complete control over electricity. Thus, over the next few weeks he experimented with his newfound power, and used all of his money to buy a rundown house, and then equip it with a makeshift electricity lab. But seeing as how he'd just wasted all of his money, he then decided to become Electro to recoup his losses, and perhaps make a little extra. But as we know, he's stolen a lot more than a little extra. Yet even this isn't enough for him, as he's now plotting to stage a prison break, and then force the escaped inmates into becoming his minions. But with that, the issue then shifts focus back to Peter, as he's heading to the hospital to see his Aunt May once again. But this time is different, as it'll be his last chance to see her before the operation. Thus he's left with a dilemma, as on his way to the hospital, he overhears police chatter and learns of Electro's unfolding prison break-in. This then begs the question, will he suit up as Spider-Man and help wrangle the convicts, or will he stay by his aunt's side throughout her operation? Peter chooses the latter option, as he continues on to the hospital, sees his aunt for what might be the last time, and then anxiously sits in the waiting room. But at least he can find comfort in the company of Betty, as she's unexpectedly arrived to wait with him. So let's let the two teenagers have their moment of solace, as we shift back to the prison that Electro's currently raiding. A legion of policemen from across the city have arrived on the scene, and whether they like it or not, they've been joined by J. Jonah Jameson. He's there to confirm his theory, as so far there's been no sign of Spider-Man. And while we of course know that the hero's simply tied up with his personal life, Jameson regards his absence as proof that he's right about him being Electro. But speaking of Electro, let's shift back to him as he's trying to take command of the horde of inmates he's just released. Unsurprisingly, many of them are just happy to be free, and don't care about him or any of his plans. So they disregard his orders, and impatiently storm their way out of the prison. But the police are there waiting for them, and these ungrateful inmates are thus swiftly apprehended. But before we can see what's to come of the rest of them, the issue suddenly shifts focus back to Peter and Betty. They've just received word that Aunt May's operation was a success, and thus quickly rush to go see her. But she's on heavy sedatives, and won't be awake or coherent until the next morning. So they head back into the waiting room, and Betty tells Peter that while she's very happy for him, she can't stay any longer, as she has to head to the Bugle and assume Jameson's office duties while he's out covering Electro's prison break. But before she goes, she rather passionately begs Peter to not go to the prison. Evidently she's grown to deeply care for him, and can't stand the thought of him being in harm's way. But the most dangerous photos are also the best paying, and Peter plainly tells this to Betty. While it's not clear why, this remark deeply hurts her, and she scorns Peter for apparently embracing the danger and excitement of it all, just like someone she once knew. With that, she leaves, and while Peter's not quite sure what had just happened, he doesn't have much time to dwell on it, as he quickly changes into his costume and heads off to confront Electro. But after their disastrous first encounter, he knows that he'll need to be savvy if he's going to take him down. So he first stops at a nearby store, and picks up a pair of rubber gloves and shoes to insulate himself against the villain. Then once he's made it to the prison, he puts them on, and positions his automatic camera to snap some photos. But before we get to the action, let's briefly shift focus to J. Jonah Jameson, who's just seen Spider-Man enter the prison, and has realized that his beloved theory is totally false. Thus there's nothing left for him to do but cry, as he knows that he'll never be taken seriously again. And of course, instead of blaming himself, he blames Peter for selling him what he thought was surefire proof of his theory. But I promised we'd get back to the action, so let's shift focus back to Electro, as he's just earned the loyalty of the remaining inmates. And what good timing, for as soon as they agree to work for him, Spider-Man drops in from out of nowhere. So they try their best to take him down, but to no one's surprise, they quickly succumb to the hero's superior spider strength. Thus in only a few moments, Electro's back to being a solo act. So he first tries to blast Spider-Man with an electric bolt, but the clever hero avoids it by tossing out a cluster of ball bearings. What this does is deflect the bolt away from him, as electricity is naturally attracted to metal. From there, Spider-Man just keeps tossing metal objects until he's close enough to punch Electro, and since he's wearing rubber gloves, he doesn't receive the electric shock that he had in their first fight. But this move ends up backfiring, as he's accidentally sent Electro tumbling into an empty cell. Thus the cell's iron bars react with the villain's native electric current, and somehow produce an intense crackling light. This light momentarily blinds Spider-Man, and gives Electro a chance to strike back. So Spider-Man, not being able to see Electro, simply releases a volley of ball bearings onto the floor, which the villain quickly slips on. But before he can then wrap up their battle with a neat little bow, a lumbering inmate sneaks in and tries to squash him from behind. While Spider-Man of course dodges the attack and then knocks out the inmate, this brief distraction gives Electro a chance to escape. So the hero begins searching for him, but quickly abandons his search when a group of inmates try fleeing through the roof exit. So he intercepts them halfway up a flight of stairs, yet knowing that they can't even hope to beat him, the inmates immediately start heading back down. Only one of them tries to put up a fight, as he pulls out a revolver that was presumably stolen from a policeman. So Spider-Man simply kicks it out of his hand, and then leads them all into the arms of a waiting group of policemen. Thus they're taken into custody, and the last of the escaped inmates have been wrangled up. But this still leaves Electro, who then appears out of nowhere and tries blasting Spider-Man with more bolts of electricity. But the hero manages to dodge them all, and, getting frustrated, Electro then picks up the revolver that had been kicked out of the inmate's hand. Spotting a nearby bucket of sand, Spider-Man quickly kicks it into Electro's face before he can fire off the gun. While this does distract the villain for a moment, it doesn't blind him like Spider-Man had hoped. As it turns out, Electro can simply electrify the sand and thus turn it into a harmless sheet of glass. But as he was discovering this new power, Spider-Man took the opportunity to clog up his revolver with a glob of webbing. Thus Electro's back to just using electricity, a few bolts of which he then forms into a crackling whip. This weapon actually proves to be his deadliest yet, as Spider-Man finds himself being helplessly cornered, and although his hands and feet are insulated, if the whip touches any other part of his body, it'll knock him out like it had before. But Spider-Man's in luck, as he happens to back himself into a large water hose. Thus he remembers that water and electricity famously don't mix, and could thus be the key to defeating Electro. So he does the obvious, and sprays the villain with a torrent of water. Sure enough, this simple tactic causes Electro to short-circuit, and fall unconscious. Thus he's been defeated, and perhaps out of plain curiosity, Spider-Man then unmasks him. But there's no twist ending this time, as Electro really is just some random guy that Spider-Man's never seen before. Thus there's not much left for him to do, so he retrieves his camera, and leaves to let the police handle the rest. The issue then skips forward a short while, and picks up with Peter as he's arrived at the Daily Bugle to meet with J. Jonah Jameson. But considering the damage that Peter's done to his reputation, the ill-tempered publisher begins the meeting by declaring that he's going to both fire and sue the teenager. But instead of defending himself, Peter defiantly tells Jameson that he won't be doing either of those things. For one, he's a freelance photographer, and thus can't actually be fired. And two, he's just snapped the only photos of Spider-Man's fight with Electro. Realizing how valuable they'd be if published, Jameson quickly calms down, and offers to forgive Peter for faking the earlier photos if he can get the new ones for free. So Peter takes this deal, and leaves Jameson's office content in having made up for his mistake. But seeing that he's already in the building, Peter then takes a moment to go talk to Betty, who's still bitter that he went to the prison. So Peter lays it out straight, and tells her that while he'd never do anything to hurt her, she can't stop him from doing what he needs to do. Betty responds by once again bringing up her mysterious past, as she mentions someone she once knew, and how this person deeply hurt her. Thus she's afraid that Peter's becoming like them, but for whatever reason, she won't share any more. Not sure what to say, Peter simply leaves in frustration, and heads off to go see Aunt May. By this point the sedatives have worn off, and she'll be out of the hospital in a few days. In the meantime Peter will have to make do on his own, so after spending some pleasant time with his aunt, he leaves to go home and get some rest. Yet as he's walking the long and lonely path back, his mind begins wandering to Betty, and just how much he regrets leaving her like he did. Wrestling with these emotions, Peter's surprised by how much he not only likes her, but seemingly needs her. Thus he can't stand the thought of hurting her, and decides to apologize the next time they meet. But he won't have to wait long, as it's then, like the ending of so many romantic comedies, that Betty flags Peter down and apologizes herself. What he then says is a mystery, as the issue subsequently ends with the two teenagers walking into the dusk, both feeling the first pangs of an emotion called love. While that concludes our story for today, Marvel has appended 2 letter pages at the end of this issue. For those unaware, letter pages were once hallmarks of the comics industry in an age before the internet. They gave Marvel an opportunity to respond to the praise, criticism, and suggestions they'd received about their stories. All of the letters presented in this issue were sent by mail to Marvel almost 60 years ago, and cover up to Amazing Spider-Man issue 5. While I will not be reading the letter pages aloud, please take a moment to look and see what readers of the time thought of this series. It's certainly an interesting experience all these years later. And with that, we've concluded Amazing Spider-Man 9, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a great story, with some of the best comic book melodrama that I've ever seen. While Electro was a solid villain and the action was fairly exciting, what really worked for this issue was its exploration of Peter Parker's personal life. We're finally moving past the high school drama and are getting a chance to see Peter as something more than just an awkward nerd, but a troubled teenager who's capable of lying for money. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.